I had a really great conversation this afternoon with the students, and we had so many questions about process and what you do when you go into the process of making a book, when you're writing, and I thought to just do something a little bit different, that rather than read from a book that some of you have read or parts of a book that some of you have read, that I would actually read from something that's still very much in progress. And you can even, it's on my iPad, it's got squiggly marks and scratch notes on it. Just because, I don't know, we're in a college, and so much of what writing is also about failing. And it's so easy to fail in private. I do it every day. And it's more interesting sometimes to see what happens when you fail in public. And I'll use the looks on your faces to sort of gauge whether or not I should continue writing this novel for another 3 years or burn it. So don't be afraid, don't be shy. Show your discontent or your scorn or your pleasure as you see fit. I also wanted to read this because this story and even parts of my last novel, there's a lot. I realized the books oftentimes connect to life on college campuses and to students. And I keep wondering why. Why do I? And when I think I remember a period in my life where I said I would, never write a campus novel, and I don't think I have. But there is something very significant about what happens on a college campus and why college campuses are such a crucible for all of these other larger debates about what we say and how we say it and who we listen to and who we don't listen to. It's the only time where you actually choose in a very explicit way what you're supposed to be, right? And that's a really formative process, and it's a fraught one. And I think it makes for good narrative fiction because you can take all the tension and complexity and sort of distill it into the space of a classroom. So I'm going to read from, I say chapter 6, but I really don't know. It's a chapter somewhere in the middle, near the end, I don't know, somewhere in this novel that doesn't have a name. And all you really need to know is that there's a narrator who's, I was going to say, who has a mother. Most of them do. And he's on his way, he's been traveling. So I'll start from there. It was a 7.5-hour flight from Paris to Chicago. Long enough, I thought, to rest and wake up with enough energy to drive straight across the Midwest. My mother and I had spent 1, maybe 2 years in and around Chicago when I was a child, but as far as I knew, neither of us had ever returned. When I asked her about that time, she had insisted that I was too young to remember anything from that period. "You were just a baby," she'd said. "You don't remember anything." And I never argued with her, even though I did have memories, however vague, of a 2-room basement apartment somewhere in the city that we must have lived in. There were other images as well of sitting alone in the back seat of a car staring at miles and miles of fields of soy and corn, and there were also pictures that S had kept and that my mother most likely would have denied existing, of the two of us sitting at a roadside ice cream stand, surrounded by long green stalks of corn, our arms stretched wide as if a child had just asked us, "How much do you love me?" And we had responded with our arms, "This much." There are pictures of us in the city standing at the base of a skyscraper or in front of a fountain with the city skyline cast behind us. We're wearing shorts in some of the photos, and others I could barely make out my mother's eyes under the layers of scarves she had wrapped around her face. In none of the pictures was I a baby. At 2:36 p.m., 5 minutes behind schedule, my flight to Chicago closed its doors and began to taxi onto the runway. As the flight attendants came down the aisles, I tapped out a short text to my mother, who in roughly 4 hours would be on her way to the airport in Virginia to pick me up. I wrote about a problem in Paris and having taken a different flight that would arrive much later. I ended with a promise to call when I landed, and by the time the flight attendant reached my aisle, I turned off my phone and was tucking it safely into the bottom of my bag. My last thought before drifting off into sleep was of a class I had taken in college. Couldn't remember the exact title of the course, but I could still picture the professor clearly, even though I had never seen him since. He had a distinct arc of hair that swept over the top of his otherwise bald head and a habit of wearing white shirts with too many buttons undone. He lectured often on the impermanent nature of seemingly fixed objects. Just because an object or even a person is in front of you means nothing, he would say. Things can be, and in fact almost always are, in more place than one. You are here, in this room, in these desks, but so what? This is only one part of you, one version of you. If I ask you, where are you? You can say, I'm in a classroom listening to some crazy man talk. Or you could be honest and say, I'm in my bed, thinking about. At the start of the semester, he turned off all the lights in the room and had us close our eyes and describe out loud where we wished we were. I wish I was at home with my mother. I wish I was asleep in my dorm room. I wish I was on a beach. I wish I was with my boyfriend, girlfriend, lover, partner, with my little brother, with my grandmother, father, with my dogs, cat, anywhere but here. When he turned the lights back on, he said, now you know why I don't take attendance. For our final assignment, he had us create what he called maps of our scattered existence. It's a way for us, he said, to see some of the vast terrain over which we're spread. He broke the project into phases because it was important, he claimed, that in this day and age we maintain a veneer of scientific precision, or else no one will take us seriously. Think of what we're doing, he said, as a DNA test of the mind. Our job is to understand not where we are from, but rather where we are and where we've been, and in the end, where we might be going. Phase 1 consisted of cataloging as many important places in our lives as we could think of. Places that we knew intimately and could and often did return to. The trip to Disney World when you were 10 doesn't count, he said, but a playground does. Childhood bedrooms, basements, backyards, swimming pools, summer homes, churches, mosques, synagogues, dentists and doctor offices, laundromats, schools, gyms, homerooms, locker rooms, any place that you can find yourself drifting off to and that you can see and describe clearly. Think big, he said. Be expansive. There will be plenty of time later to edit it down, but for now, our goal is to try and capture as much of the world as we know. I could remember watching as the other students spent the bulk of one class writing, stopping only occasionally to ponder a name or an address. We were told we needed to have at least 20 places we could describe in intimate detail in order for our projects to work. And by the time the class was over, I had only 5. Over the next few days, I struggled to name even more, and at the end of the week, I called my mother for help, even though we had been specifically told not to look beyond ourselves. If you can't remember it, the professor said, odds are it isn't relevant to the project. My mother and I spoke once, maybe twice a month at that point, which may not have been much compared to other families, but my mother rarely, if ever, complained. When I left home for college, she told me, what matters is that we talk. Even if it's only for 5 minutes, I don't care. Our conversations lasted for an hour, sometimes more, and the longer I was away from home, the more I recognized there was something more than just maternal affection on the other end. Increasingly, there was humor and the occasional flash of regrets and anger in my mother's voice. She asked me if I had a girlfriend. On some days, she said, you don't need to be serious with anyone, and on others, she said she worried I was alone out there in college. I would be much happier, she said, if I knew you had someone. She asked about the friends she would most likely never meet, and my evenings and weekends in dorm rooms, while saying as little as possible about herself. Work is work, she would say. I go there, I come back, they pay me, and then I send all of the money to your school. She would always remind me to call S and Elsa when I had a chance. They think I'm a terrible mother for letting you go so far away, but that's not true, is it? Letting you go was what I did right. When I called her that evening, I had a hard time explaining what I wanted her help with. I told her I was taking a psychology course on ontology, which I hoped would impress her. We're studying memory, I said, and I need your help. We need to come up with a list of places that we loved from our childhood, and the professor said we should ask our family for help. I don't understand, she said. This is a class. Yes, I said, it's for a class. I could hear what sounded like water running in the background. This is a joke. It's not a joke, I said. Because I don't understand it, she said. What's supposed to be funny? It's for a philosophy class. I said, you're lying, she said. I can tell. I'm not. I promise. She turned off whatever was running. I thought I could hear her sitting down on the plush gray couch that took up most of our living room. This is a real class? Yes, it's a real class. And what's the professor's name? Why does that matter? I want to talk to him. Why? That's none of your business. You can't call professors. I want to ask him a question. What? How can I get my money back? This is America. I want a refund. Asad told me once that my mother was the funniest person he had ever met. The things she would say, you wouldn't believe. But when I pressed for more details, he retreated behind language. You can't say it in English, he told me. The words don't make sense, and you wouldn't understand. As I got older, I saw more flashes of that humor, as whatever it was that had kept it at bay began to diminish. Ines was right. I didn't understand much of what made my mother laugh, but nor did I feel the need to. It was enough to be the occasional spectator, and when the opportunity presented itself, do my best to keep up with her. It's too late for a refund, I told her. The class is almost over. She tissed. I'm worried about you, she said. Now that I see what you're studying, what kind of job do you expect to get? People are going to ask, what can you do and what will you say? What playground do you like to play in? She continued for as long as she could before eventually circling back to the initial question I asked her. I don't know what you want me to tell you, she said. If we were going to the park, you said okay. If I said we were going to school, you said okay. If I said you were going to the hospital, you said okay. You never asked to go anywhere. I used to think you were just trying to make me happy, but it was the same with food, clothes. Okay, Maye. Okay, Mommy. Elsa used to call you Professor Okay when you were little. Do you remember that? I lied and said I did. You never complained. You were happy wherever you were. The next day I met with my professor and told him that despite my best efforts, I would never come up with as many places as he wanted or believed possible. He leaned forward in his chair and asked to see my list. I typed out a longer version. Number 1, the park, a few blocks away from my home with a large picnic area and a trail that led back into the woods. In the back of the woods, there was a little footbridge and a stream underneath. Number 2, my home. Number 3, S and Elsa's apartment. Number 4, the top floor of the public library. And number 5, I wrote in by hand shortly after talking with my mother, the grocery store. The professor folded the piece of paper I had given him in half. Grocery store, he said. It was organic, I told him. Well then, he said, that explains everything. He folded the paper once more until it was a neat little square that fit perfectly into the palm of his hands. Most students, he said, have to be cut off. They come in with 100 places that they claim are very important to them. Their first grade classroom, their treehouse, the back seat of their car. I have to beg them to stop writing. He flicked the square across his desk and straight into my lap. Other than the grocery store, he said, is there anything about these places that you can elaborate on? What was your favorite room at home, for example? I shook my head. It was the first time I'd spoken with him outside of class, and I wanted to tell him we didn't live in those kinds of apartments. In my mother's home, there had been one bedroom with 2 twin beds on opposite sides of a room, cleaved in half by a dresser and bamboo screen. The bathroom door was the only one that closed properly, and we spent all but our waking hours in the living room and kitchen. The same had been true at S and Elsa's apartment, except there I slept on the couch and could hear them whispering once they thought I was asleep. They were small apartments, I told him. He asked me to describe the town, the neighborhood, places that I went to after school. What was your neighborhood like, he asked me. What kind of places did you hang out in after school? I wanted to tell him again that those were the wrong questions. They belonged to a version of America different from the one I had grown up in. We lived in apartment buildings surrounded by other apartment buildings, behind which were 4-lane highways that led to similar apartments. We went to school or work in the mornings and returned straight home at the end of the day. There wasn't much of a town, I told him, and we spent a lot of time at home. I remember then the professor leaned back in his chair as if and said if I wasn't going to try, there was no point in having this conversation. Do you think you're the first student I've had with an unhappy childhood? You're not, he said. I wanted to tell him once more, though, that he was speaking the wrong words, that I didn't live in the world of happy and unhappy childhoods, happy and unhappy families. We worked. We did what we had to do and never considered other options. He went on to say something about embracing the good and the bad, the yin and the yang, and I could hear my mother's voice whispering over my shoulder, "What is this crazy man talking about? How do I get my money back?" He must have caught me smiling because he finally looked directly at me and asked, "Are you following me?" I nodded yes. "I understand," I said, "mix the good and the bad." He asked me where my family was from. I told him my mother was from Ethiopia. "And your father?" "From around the same area," I said. He swiveled in his chair. "Believe me," he said, "I know what it's like. Last year I had a student from Iraq in my class, another from Pakistan. You would never believe the things they lived through." I wanted to tell him that I knew what it was like as well, that I'd sat in similar chairs in front of other teachers, in offices that were larger and smaller than his, and I'd smiled and nodded politely when told of the friend, the cab driver, grocery store clerk, former student, neighbor, who, like my mother, had lived a life that was somehow impossible to believe in. "You're right," I told him, although about what I was uncertain. "It's difficult," he said. "Yes," I told him, "it has been." We nodded, I suppose in agreement. I stood to leave the office, and as I opened the door, he half mumbled, "Don't be afraid to get your hands dirty." I responded right away. I turned around and raised my palms so he could see them. "I was born with dirty hands," I said. I left before I could see his reaction and wandered the campus, wondering if I had mocked him or offended him. Later that afternoon, I told my friend Claire about the exchange. "Why would you say that?" she asked me. "I have no idea," I told her. "And he really said, 'Don't be afraid to get your hands dirty'?" "He did, but I'm not sure he knew what he meant." She took my hands and placed them around her waist and whispered into my ear, "So you've got dirty hands, do you? How dirty are they?" "Pretty dirty," I said. "When was the last time you washed them?" "Never," I said. "I've never washed them." We laughed on our way onto her bed before undressing, and she pointed to the bathroom in the hallway. It was only the third time we'd been together, and we found it easier to act as if we already knew this was something we'd only half remember when looked back upon. At some point later that afternoon, it was time for me to leave. Claire had a class or a meeting to get to, and so far we'd always said our goodbyes on the same casual terms. "I won't be gone long," she said. When she returned hours later, she found me half asleep with my computer open. I decided to rewrite my list of places which so far had come up empty. Claire lay next to me and closed the screen. "Don't do it," she said. "What?" I asked her. "Don't give him what he wants. Don't tell him anything about yourself. Don't tell him about your home or your mother or anything. I've been thinking about it. Next year, he's going to tell someone, I had this student from Nigeria or Mali, and he won't remember your name, but he'll say, bright kid, full of potential. And boom, that's it. You're gone. You'll be like one of those trophies on a wall. You'll be hanging up there next to the kid from Iraq. And it won't matter what you say or write. The story is over. You're a means to an end, and the only thing you can do is never let them know you. Claire slid my computer off the bed. You have to go now, she said. This isn't a hotel. Go make something up and pretend that it's you. I did as she said. I went to my room and found the pages of a stolen library book, the fake driver's license I'd come to college with. I had picked it up in a rural shopping mall at a store that sold novelty items alongside comic books and home cleaning supplies. There was a photo booth in the back of the store with a color-coded map of the United States. A man explained that they sold costume forms of identification for entertainment purposes. He pointed to the states on the map, Illinois, Ohio, Colorado. He gestured to the phone book. He never said to pick a name and address for the books themselves, but that was what I did. I chose Chicago. I opened up the phone book to a random page near the end and with my eyes closed, landed on a name. Christopher T. Williams of Park Forest Road. That was all the information I had or needed. My photo was taken and 20 minutes later, a poorly laminated piece of plastic was handed over to me with a birth date 5 years before my own. The ID itself was of such poor quality I never risked using it, but I carried it in my wallet, and when the time came to leave home, I stored it safely between the pages of a novel. I wrote most of that night, and for the bulk of the next 2 days, I consulted maps and encyclopedias and archives for photographs, descriptions, newspaper accounts. I closed my eyes for long stretches of time and tried to imagine a young man more or less my height as he cut through parks and playgrounds and shopping mall parking lots. I looked up the schools Christopher T. Williams would have gone to. I found pictures from old yearbooks. I mapped out the distances between his home and school, and then on a blank page wrote the information as if it had always been mine. Christopher T. Williams had been happy enough as a child, I decided. He was well-liked, but not popular, private, but not quiet or shy. And his yearbook students wrote comments such as, "Great to know you, you're a good guy," and "Hey, Chris, it was nice sitting next to you, wish I knew you better." He was a runner, but not an athlete, and there was a park a few blocks from his home with a large swimming pool. He ran there in the morning, especially in the spring or fall. He had part-time jobs at a grocery store. He rode his bike to school and work. There was a candy factory a few blocks from his home, and he imagined when he got older he would work there. There were a string of diners that he went to after school and on Saturday afternoons. He went to the movies as often as he could, and he would pay for an early matinee and then linger in the bathroom until it was safe to sneak into whatever movie was playing next. As he got older, he would take the train downtown and walk along one of the narrow city beaches. He would wait until the beaches and park that surrounded them had emptied out. He would wonder then, as he walked back to the train, if he would make it back safely, if there wasn't someone following him, waiting to attack. When I finished, I showed Claire what I had written. "I made it up," I said, "just like you told me." I handed her Christopher T. Williams' license. "I got it in high school," I told her, "but I never had any use for it until now." She held in the license next to my face. "Doesn't even look like you," she said. I was skinnier then. "It's like you, but twice removed." I tried to explain to her how much time I had spent creating a life that wasn't mine and what it meant to do so. I told her I felt like I could see the life of Christopher T. Williams better than I could see my own. "That's disturbing," she said, "but I'm not surprised. Sometimes I look at you and I think things go right through you, like there's a hole in the middle where something solid should be. She kissed me on the cheek, and while her face was still close to mine, she added, "And that's why we both know this has to end." Thank you. Stop there. So much longer than you think when you're reading it. You're like, when is this going to end? Anyway, I'm not going to look at your faces too closely. I don't have that courage. But if you have questions, I'm happy to have a conversation. And obviously not about this work, but anything in general, from other things you might have read by other people, also is open for debate. Yes?
So, in the work you read, and then also in a lot of your books, you talk about how there's like this displacement with the connection between people and where they're from. Can you talk a little bit about like how you put yourself in like the idea of characters who feel displaced and where that comes from?
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this earlier, the idea of the sort of like the immigrant novel being a very problematic and at the same time important term. And I always used to argue that the idea of the immigrant is really no different from any other form of displacement, like radical displacement that people feel in their lives. It's a more intense form of losing home, and that home can be defined as lots of different things, but people feel variations of that many times over, right? You lose a home, which is one very dramatic sort of form of displacement, but you lose people you love all the time, and that's another way in which I think you're radically alienated from the self that existed before then. I left Ethiopia when I was 2 years old. I don't have any, sort of like displacement issues in that regard. Like I grew up in America, in the Midwest. I mean, America was always home and the only home I've really known. But yet that sense of loss never left, right? It's always sort of permeated our home, and still I think permeates my understanding of myself. And that's not something, I think that's something that's magnified by certain types of experiences, but I don't think it's singular or sort of unique, right? And so one sort of problem or challenge, I think, when we sort of isolate narratives to certain categories and we say that's those people's experiences, we also ignore the ways in which we participate in that, right? The ways in which we share in those experiences doesn't mean they're the same, right? It's very important to recognize there can be radical differences, but that those experiences aren't necessarily alien to us, right? The categorization of like those stories or those people does that work of actually sort of distancing us from them in a way that's very problematic. So oftentimes I feel like what I really care about most is actually is sort of what you're saying, right? That idea of having lost a sense, right? Having lost a sense of home, having lost a sense of self, and what it takes to reconstruct and remake that. We're all fictional characters in our own way, right? We all have to construct, and that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. The fact that we can actively participate in the construction of who we are, it's a really important thing, but it also means respecting and understanding that that construction comes only with a certain type of loss, right? Like we need to be able to also recognize that we lose things and that we have to replace and rebuild ourselves constantly. It makes us more interesting if we can do that. Yeah.
How much of your experience do you like influence your work, especially because I was just thinking a lot about how you were a journalist and how that affects like all our news.
Yeah, it always surprises me. Like, the self comes into the work, whether, I don't know any novelist who really is like, can't see me anywhere in my work. It always intrudes. It always becomes a part of the text, and it's always interesting to find out how it does so. So, like with journalism, I would do journalism after a novel was finished, and part of the idea being that I wanted to go out into the world and it kind of like re-engage with what's actually happening, so it's not just sort of inside of my head. And also because so much of what I was writing about concerned issues of violence and displacement across Africa, and I wanted to also make sure that I was like ethically liable for those stories, that I'd actually had some experience and some direct encounter with the lives that I was also deeply vested in imagining. What would normally happen, though, is that I would write about it in nonfiction. I would do a story or a magazine article, and the story wouldn't feel complete. Like there would be something left. There's oftentimes, many thousands of words and images that you can't use when you write a piece of journalism. But more than that, there was people that you didn't know what to do with anymore. Like the story had been written, but yet at the same time you weren't finished with the story, and the story wasn't finished with you. And so you had to sort of go back to it. In all our names, a lot of it comes from a lot of the experiences that the two characters have when they're traveling through Africa, and a lot of the violence that they experience. A lot of that comes from soldiers that I met while traveling through Sudan and northern Uganda. And there was a group of, like, when I first went to Sudan, it was the first piece of reporting that I'd done, and I met a group of 16-year-old boys, and they were they were rebel soldiers fighting against a militia and a government that they had no chance of winning against. And we were staying with them in this remote village. And they were great. They were really kind, and they were sort of protecting us because we were journalists and we didn't have weapons, but they did. And we would ask them, the first couple days we were there, like, what do you want to do? What do you want to be? And they would all say, we're revolutionaries. Like, that's what we want to do. We want to be here fighting for revolution. And they, had revolutionary names and a lot of bravado, and they loved having their picture taken with their guns. And then by about the third day, when we were getting ready to leave and we were asking them what they wanted to do, that facade began to sort of like wear down. And one of the boys said, if I could do anything, I would go to school. I would be a student, and that would be what I would do. And he said, but I know that's never going to happen for me, right? Like, he was 15, but he said, I'm fighting now for the next generation, even though his generation hadn't even grown up yet. So those, I never felt like I knew what to do with him, right? Like, I wrote the scene to some degree, but it never felt, it'll never feel complete either, right? Like, there's no terminal point. I'll never write him in a way that, because you can't, because he's alive, he's a human being. So there's no way of actually really fully making them described, right? There should always be some gap between what you want to say about them and who they actually are. But I felt like I hadn't said enough, and they lingered, right? And so writing All Our Names became really, almost from the beginning, partly a way to get back to that story, and partly a way to fill that space for myself. And then, fiction takes over, and then it stops being about that particular memory in the story. You have to maintain the sort of fidelity to the work of art that you're trying to create. But I know that book wouldn't have been written without those people. Similarities between reporting journalism and writing a book. Funny thing is, I sort of hate reporting journalism. I mean, but yet when I don't do it, I miss the experience. When you write fiction, you have years. Like, it takes me years to do a book, and oftentimes I wish that it didn't, but then I actually realize it takes me years because I think I probably love the sort of pace of that. I love the slow interrogation and the kind of unwinding, and the language is very different. When I do journalism, you're sort of called to a different, obviously, set of standards. I'm not like an objective journalist. I'm not writing for the New York Times. If I'm doing a story, it's because I'm like, there's a problem out there, and not because I can fix it, right, but because and the problem isn't what's happening. The problem is I just don't like the way a story is being told. And oftentimes it's because the story is being reduced to very simple tropes of ethnic violence, of tribal violence, of whatever types of generic terminology gets thrown out there. So I'm trying to address very much that particular problem in the writing. Whereas fiction, like, I've got no idea what I'm doing. I mean, I'm just wandering blindly from chapter to chapter, hoping something arrives and kind of forms into some cohesive whole. And nonfiction, I find it really, it's emotionally hard in a way that almost after every story I've done, I sort of want to never do it again. And And yeah, I don't feel that way about fiction. I feel like, when I write fiction, you need a break, I think, or I do, but the nonfiction it hurts in a different way.
So I guess this is more like advice-based, I hope it makes sense, but how do you kind of balance like a large idea and like scaling it so that you're not like biting off a lot in one, do you know what I mean? Like biting off too much to cover in like one book or one plot line or something?
Well, I don't know. Why should you not? Why should you not try?
Just like the balance, I guess, of like making sense versus like making this idea that like you can't grasp or something. Not you, but
Yeah.
readers wouldn't be able to grasp.
Well, I think there's something important about not underestimating your readers. Partly because you're never really underestimating your readers. It's always yourself, right? Like you're always, if you're saying too many things, if you're anxious about a story's meaning being clear, you're really anxious about your own ability to actually say something clearly, or whether or not your thoughts are coming through, and so you over-narrate and you over-dictate and you over-control the story. And I'd say if something feels like a little bit wild and kind of like uncontrolled, I don't know, I feel like that's where you want to be. Like that's where it's like interesting. And the idea shouldn't be to feel like you need to rein it in, but to see just how messy and undisturbing it can get. And then there's plenty of time to figure out like how to make sure the pieces all hold together. But I wouldn't want to go into writing something like Toni Morrison has this sort of great idea where somebody asked her if the characters in, I think, Song of Solomon were, if she was trying to suggest they were lesbian. And she's like, when I'm writing fiction, why would I possibly withhold? Why would I possibly control myself? That's mine. Like, that's my space. That's my world that I'm getting to build. I'm not going to minimize it or redact it or hide it for anybody. And I think that's a pretty important way to approach it. The time may come where you very well may need to, but not now. Like go big, like go messy, and then pull it together. But the last words can't be "go messy." Come on. Al? Yeah. It came very quickly on the heels of having written another book that failed, and I think I spent 5 years. So I started it when I was in college, my sophomore, junior year, and then I went to graduate school and kept writing the same book. And I finished graduate school and I kept writing the same book. And then finally, after about 6 years of writing it, I decided that I needed to try to publish this, really boring, very boring book about people in the Midwest waiting for it to rain. Like literally nothing happened. It's like 400 pages of people walking around wondering when the next rainstorm is coming, and they literally look up at the clouds like every other page, and just puzzle over the sky. So that book failed. And I was like devastated. I sent it out to, there's like 500 agents in New York, and I sent it out to like 478, and I was sort of, I don't know if I was ready to give up, but it was like a hard thing, and then I was sad and unhappy and bemoaning my existence. And then I was walking past a grocery store one evening, and there was a man behind the counter of a little grocery store in Washington, D.C., and I heard like a little voice in my head that said, "No one comes into the store anymore." And I went home and started writing that evening, and probably been the first time I'd written in about a year. And the first 6-7 pages of the book came out that night, and then for the next 3 years, I worked multiple odd jobs, but this book began to slowly take shape. But almost right away, I remember the very first night, I gave the character a name, and the name was the same name my grandfather had wanted to name me when I was a child. in Ethiopia, but it's not my name. And as soon as that name entered the page, I was like, oh, there's something. And then, yeah, so.
Kind of going with the like the behind the scenes rather than the novel itself. Did you get a literary agent, or did you just kind of like act as your own agent?
You kind of really can't act as your own agent if you're writing fiction or nonfiction. If you're working with some small independent publishers, you can, and definitely university presses. So I should actually retract that. And I have friends who publish really wonderful works with some really great independent presses. Even then, I think it's still advisable to have somebody, because it's contracts, and I don't know anything about contracts. Also, I feel like as writers, like my administrative skills, although they're getting better, like going to the post office still terrifies me. So having somebody to sort of help that is quite important. But also generally, if you're trying to write and sell it and working with a large publisher, they force you to have an agent because it's in your best interest. But don't worry about those are that's like it should really be about the work for as long as you possibly can. Like hold on to and even if you do have an agent, you have a publisher, you still have to try to find your way back to the thing that actually matters. The commercial side, the professional, all of those things will try and kind of separate you from the thing itself, right? And the thing itself is what makes you learn to, it's what gets you to write in the beginning. It's the love of language, and it's the love of literature, right? So you want to try to make sure you can find your way back into that. And all these other things might be important, but every single one of them is to some degree a blinder from that very basic joy and that interaction and that experience. So try to keep that separate as much as you possibly can for as long as you can. And then when you can't keep it separate, try to find your way back to it. So
I have a question about something that you read, or about what you read.
did you like it?
The narrator, I have like a need to know, like, does the narrator turn in the assignment, and what happens?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm about 100 pages past that point. I still don't know. But now I've got to go and think about that. Does he even graduate from college? I think so. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so
If you have any,
TBA.
I'm open to ideas though. It's a totally fluid process.
I was gonna, I guess, ask a somewhat related question, which is, it sounds like your first published novel took shape around a kind of moment of inspiration, maybe. But this you've sort of described as a sort of more open-ended. You're sort of writing without yet knowing. I guess I'm wondering if the way you've conceived more recent books is different than that first experience of seeing the man in the grocery store and somehow it just kind of taking shape. Has your writing experience changed now, where it feels more open, or?
I feel this feels more like writing my first book than, and partly because it's like finding the way back to that initial joy in the writing process. And the book starts with the death of somebody, and it's very closely related to somebody, a close family friend who committed suicide out of nowhere, it seemed to us. And so there was a line that began with that problem. But then as the book has sort of grown and sort of metastasized from there, it's even in the sorrow and the sort of the pain that's I think sort of really resides throughout it. I've been able to kind of enjoy it the same way that other book was, and partly because I think last time I knew what it was to fail, and going back to writing felt like such a relief, right? That I still wanted to do it. And as you get older, there's so many reasons not to do it, and the fact that you find a way to go back to it when life changes in such dramatic ways, or you don't think that will happen again. And so the fact that it does, it's joy again. So, yeah. Yeah.
We have time for maybe one more question. Please go.
In class, you kind of talked about how when you were starting off as a writer, it was kind of this silence about yourself as a writer. And I just wanted to know, for your students, what do you tell them to build their confidence as young writers?
I don't know if I do any. Maybe just pointed to a flaw in my teaching. Well, because I mean, I guess some of it for me is also it's confidence is, I guess, important, but I don't know how much of that I've ever really had when it comes to writing. Like writing has always felt like this sort of private thing that exists out of a kind of necessity, right? And wanting to be able to kind of preserve that involved continuing to write. What I do think I try really hard to do with them, though, is for them to also think of the writing both as this very deeply personal act that comes from someplace because you care about it, but that it's also this space where you can take all the ways in which you think of and engage with the world and translate that into the writing, right? So it's not just about you and how you feel, but it's also about all the things that you sort of see and react to, and wanting to find a way to translate that, because it's the only way. Like, I can't understand the world I live in if I don't write. Like, writing is it's like having a constant act of interpretation for me. And when I cease to do that, the world feels a little bit feels messier in a way that I don't particularly like. But I can understand it and sort of, I had a great teacher in college who taught a class called Writing as Religion, and he had the idea that, and this was at a Catholic institution as well, so there was a lot of interesting ways in which he tried to sort of make this argument, but that, faith gives us ways of interpreting the world. It gives us sort of a scaffolding through which we can understand our relationship to the world around us, right? And it gives us something greater. And that writing can do something very similar, right? Writing performs a sort of structuring mechanism for our lives. And reading, by extension, does the same thing. You can't sort of extract one from the other. But that the act of writing becomes one way of also participating in that. And it takes a certain faith in the possibility of being able to actually engage with the world that writing enacts, and the kind of solitude, too, that's inherent in it. So, so I don't know if you need confidence so much. You need faith, but